becoming aware of the ground. Let the feet fully notice the ground, the bottoms of the feet, let them fully greet the ground. Become fully cognizant of the ground. Willingly enter the ground, and then be willing for the ground to enter up through you. So it's a mutual thing, yin and yang. So in terms of concepts and terminology, down is yin, sinking is yin, downing is yin, and rising is yang, and pushing is yang. So we're doing yin and yang energies, qualities. So splitting them first, becoming cognizant of one at a time, and then you become aware of both. So first, to isolate them and emphasize them. Entering the ground willingly. Let the weight free fall through your body, accumulating in the feet. And then the feet can even spread out and become better greeters of the ground, fully agreeing with the ground, with its underside surface. Meeting the ground, entering the ground, and then being aware to the possibility of the other way, the other direction. The ground can meet us. And then over time, we become better and better at allowing the ground to enter. Eventually further and further and further, right up to the very top of the head and even beyond. So just having that awareness of that possibility can help that process. And then both at the same time, eventually, the more I can soften and release, the more I can song, release and flow down, eventually the more I can allow that ground force to move up cleanly and freely. Eventually with my developing ting, inner sensitivity, inner awareness, I can feel that how far it gets before it gets kind of occluded. And as my ability to song and my awareness, my ting increases, that process can develop further and further. So as best you can, working with both for a moment, settling, hanging, physically, consciously, sensationally, feeling the senses, the sense of entering the ground, settling into the ground, and then kind of flipping that awareness on its head, flipping it around, the ground entering you. That same force, that same pressure is coming up. Of course, we all know that, gravity, we're standing on the ground, that gravity working this way, the weight is entering the ground. Without this kind of training, we never think of the opposite, which is equally true. The ground force working up through us, it's equally true. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Physics. So we get to now emphasize that aspect to develop it. Just do what normal people never do, becoming aware of that action and emphasizing it, developing our awareness of it, developing our ability to allow it. And what's really interesting, as we develop that other way, we get better at releasing and the down part as well. They feed each other and develop each other. Okay, maybe just make sure your knees are bent a little bit, rock out of that for a moment. We'll take a little mini break if you want to move your joints around a little bit. Let me know if you have any comments or questions on that process or things that I mentioned. So that's a core basic process of standing. There's many other little details and slight different angles we approach things that we talked about, but that's one way of kind of boiling things down. Of course, we want to take that into movement, not just standing. You know, of course, we talked about basic weight shifting, press down, ground force, pushes it back. So we just become better and more refined. So again, standing is the microscope. It's our study time to develop these things, and then we take that into our Tai Chi and into our individual movements. And so our body and our mind are better vehicles for Tai Chi and better applicators of the principles. So we get more from our Tai Chi.
Can I ask a question? If this doesn't fit the full of the class, this could be a later, outside of class. So if we're releasing our abdomen, why don't we focus on standing with our pubic bone hanging down rather than the tailbone? Like, to me, those I've always felt a little contradictory.
Okay. Okay. So,
like what I think, because you talk about like toddlers are natural. Well, they would, it seems as if they stand pubic bone down rather than tailbone down.
Okay, so let me address that first and then go to the first thing, toddlers. It's true that, and I say it, often, that in Taoism, Taoist arts and Tai Chi, we're using young people, toddlers, infants as ideals, physically and mentally. I say that all the time. And that's a general message. It's not 100% true. It gets a message across, and there's some strong visuals. And predominantly, there's the qualities, mentally and physically, are what we want to regain. But it's not 100% the model or ideal. Largely, it is. Well, here's a simple example of that. The aspect of the mind, the body is fairly straightforward. We want to be soft, released, like a toddler or an infant, and then make the same correlation with the mind. Say a very young person's mind is open and free. They're not caught up in thoughts and thinking all the time. Certainly not caught up in worry. There's not even the concept of worry yet. So that's very much a ideal in the sense of something to quote unquote work towards or get back. So it's very useful. But here's the example. We don't want to be exactly like a toddler's mind, because I'll let my bodily functions just go right now as I'm standing here. And on and on. Like we want the intellect is a part of our organic and quote unquote divine abilities. So we don't want to throw the intellect out and throw other aspects of our mental capabilities out. If the toddler or infant was 100% ideal, then we'd be criticizing, don't ever think, never think. Now it's compared to the Western way of being and thinking and what we're used to, it's much more towards the direction of that infant or toddler. It's much more towards the direction of that empty, spacious mind where there's no thought. In fact, Zen, you'll often hear the cliches and the things about Zen and, empty the mind, no thought. And there's terms for no mind, the void, and no mind, and no thought. And that's a huge part of, for example, Zen. It's because we have to go so much in that direction to come back to being whole again, yin and yang, which is empty and also form. But we need to go so far in that direction. to start to come back to a realized integrative balance. And so toddlers, they're a potent example. So toddlers may or may not be hanging their tailbone. Certainly what they're not doing is they're not standing up like this, generally speaking. Now, as far as specifically the first part of that question, I've never come across, I've never thought of that before. I've never had that question presented before. And so as you frame that question, I experimented and tried it myself. And there's probably other ways to work it where it will fit in with the type of hanging and type of body we want. It's probably a way to work with it. But as I just kind of hung the pubic bone, what it does is sends us back. So it creates this action where we want this action. Now, we don't want to go too far and tuck the chin, or sorry, tuck the tailbone underneath, so it's not a pelvic tilt. That's kind of a corollary to what I said about, the toddler being a general example. We want to go in that direction, but we don't want to go 100% there and become, drooling, gaga, goo goo, that kind of thing. 100% being a toddler. No, I don't want to say tuck the tailbone. So that's kind of a corollary here physically. We want to tuck the tailbone, but that doesn't mean this. So when I hang from the pubic bone, it makes me frontal, and I find the angle is going this way rather than this way. Now, as I said, there's maybe a way to engineer it or do it in a slightly different way where we can keep what we want. But what I am getting right now is that and let's try this in our standing, because this is actually what we want. And this is actually, now, it would include the pubic bone. It's not emphasizing the pubic bone, but really what we want is to include it. Now, I'll get a little bit more specific in just a moment. But here's another example of, we emphasize certain things. It doesn't mean that that's it. We're emphasizing certain things to go in a certain direction, to change things in a certain direction, to get to somewhere better, get closer to a place than where we are now. So we spend a lot of time talking about toddlers, infants, mentally, physically, wonderful, ideal. We spend so much time talking about hang the tailbone, lengthen the lower back. That's not it. That sets us in a certain direction, because everybody's the opposite. So we spend so much time engineering and pinpointing those things, but that's not it in and of itself. It becomes more whole and complete, where what I really eventually want is hanging the whole hip cage. It's not doing this specifically, isolatively, gets us towards the right direction. But once this is actually really free and I am actually hanging out, the whole hip cage hangs. So if I go back to actually a skeleton dangling, the skeleton isn't trying to send the tailbone down, or the skeleton isn't trying to lengthen the lower back. The hip cage of the skeleton is just hanging. So the pubic bone and the tailbone, they're the same. They're hanging the same. So what I wanted to say then was emphasizing that, or another way of putting this is, you hang the hip cage, and when I hang the hip cage, it is completely equal. In fact, one of you has heard this image before. It's like hip cage hangs just like a lantern that's swinging. That's hip cage. It actually hangs and swivels. It completely hangs. That means that the pubic bone is not excluded and it's not left out. This is all, it's like a ball hanging or a cage hanging. Does that make sense? Let me know what you think about that. If this is actually hanging, like literally hanging from a chain, it's hanging. It's not the pubic bone, it's not the tailbone, it's hanging. But most people, if we say hang the hip cage, hang the hips, because this is decades long of being foreshortened and tightened, they don't know what a hanging tailbone is. They don't know what at length and lower. They have to do it mechanically, physically. So let me try to illustrate it. So here we have this concaveness and this shortness here, and then it's a normal thing. And someone says, okay, now just hang the hips. Now, assuming I've got the leg strength to allow that to occur, people don't, but let's say that I've got the leg strength to attempt to hang the hips. I don't know if you can see, but my butt's kind of sticking out, or certainly I have a curve here. Okay, hang my hips. Are my hips hanging? Hips aren't hanging. I don't know how to hang my hips. I can't release, no way I can release these muscles that have been foreshortened for decades. I can't hang my hips no matter how much I try. So mechanically, okay, point the tailbone towards the ground. Stretch or lengthen your lower back. So I need to do those mechanical things to get this part right, to get all of it closer to being right. And so everything we do in Tai Chi, all these things we do and say are little engineering feats to get us towards a direction, to approximate something, to get us towards a direction, to get us towards a result. So since all of us here have a certain amount of experience, let's play with this idea of hanging the hips. Like, to be almost literally hanging. So if you had, like, again, a lantern hanging from a chain, let your hips hang as best you can. This is where a mirror might be handy. It takes a lot of ting, a lot of inner awareness to recognize, am I hanging the hips? Here I'm not really. I've dropped, I've bent my knees and I've dropped, and maybe I've released to a certain extent, but my hips aren't hanging vertically yet. I'm still back here. Of course, maybe then another person might over try and then correct this way and think that they're hanging the hips. So it takes a lot of inner awareness and developing the inner awareness. So you hang the hips so that the hips are hanging completely straight down, completely vertical. And that creates that, if the hips are truly hanging vertical, the lower back will be almost straight. The tailbone will be pointing towards the ground, not because I'm trying to point the tailbone towards the ground, but because I'm now hanging the hips, like truly hanging the hips. That means the pubic bone is hanging directly as well. Tailbone, pubic bone, they're doing the same. So any comments or questions?
I find it easier to do, hang the hips, with my knees straight though. Because as soon as my knees are bent, I feel that my hips can't go straight.
Okay, that's very interesting and a little bit perplexing for me. So I want to pursue that a little bit further. So what happens when the knees are bent for you to your hips?
They feel like they're flexed forward, right? A little, like it just feels like a different angle, but maybe I'm thinking more of my thighs than I am my hips, right?
So let's pursue that a little bit. What I would say is you can't hang your hips if your knees are straight. I would feel strongly enough
Okay.
to simply put that out as a blanket statement.
Okay.
Yeah. So then accepting that, however it feels, your hips aren't hanging if your knees are straight or almost straight. So we'll say that we'll make that as a given. And so whatever you're feeling now with the legs, knees straight or almost straight, I would suggest that the hips aren't hanging. Now you're saying that when you bend the knees a bit more, it tends to tilt the pelvis or the tailbone too much forward?
No, it just feels like it's not straight. I don't, now that you've said that, I realize I'm going too low with my hips. I need to think more of my pelvis and, the spine for my hips, because they're up higher than the thighs. I'm just thinking too low, I think.
You're thinking down here?
Yeah, down, I don't know. I just feel like my legs are crooked. So how come my my hips be straight.
Mm.
I don't know. I'm pretty complicated. I don't know.
Let's try this. This may or may not help, but I'll mention this here. So, and it'll give the at least a rationalization of why we're saying bend the knees. If we stand up right now, so let's kind of maybe even exaggerate a bit, stand up, so we're letting this be short and tight, knees are locked. By simply bending the knees for, and we can go into a deeper knee bend than we normally would for standing. Have the knees bend forward over the feet. And do you feel that that pulls the lower back straighter or flatter? Does that action happen?
I automatically change my spine when I bend my knees. I think that's just all the Tai Chi. You know, as soon as I bend my knees, I hang my spine, my tailbone, and yeah, it just automatically happens.
Let's try this. So again, you all stand up to exaggerate the contrast. So the knees are locked, and this is definitely curved and tight. Now, if you can then, what we're going to do is we're going to bend the knees more than usual, bend the knees over the feet to pull the tailbone down and to pull the lower back straighter, flatter, even. And if you're able to release when you do that too, that's great. But we wouldn't have to release anything. We're just mechanically, in terms of angles, having the bending knees, bending forward, pull the tailbone down and pull the lower back a little straighter. So to one degree or another, whether you're fairly released about it or not, can you get the sense that does the lower back get straight or almost straight as you bend those knees forward? Does that happen?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, that angle that's here, and what that also means is whatever angle that creates in this whole area, we're emphasizing this almost being straight, and whatever that means for the entire hip cage. Don't let that angle change. So we're approximating more what we want. Don't let that change, but bring your knees up a bit so they're less bent, but keep that the same. Now, that's not hanging the hips because we're probably holding it, but that's closer to the right angles. Now, from that approximate, more correct angle, see how much you can release things to have that hang. Now, we can only release as far as we can release. And so it takes a lot of training, a lot of songing, a lot of releasing over a long period of time to really release, especially, these muscles are very big and dense. To really have these muscles let go, to truly have the hip cage hang. Well, to start with, we want the right angles and shape. And then it's a matter of releasing, songing. So let me know, and I'm not sure if I've directly or effectively addressed your thought or your situation. So if you please let me know, phrase a question or any comment about what's happening there, or if that has brought you to any, gives you any direction to go with. So
I think it has. Yeah, I think it'll take a bit of practice and concentration.
Yeah. As is often the case, especially without a mirror or having someone with experience to be able to adjust, what we think we have may not be what we have, or there's a lot further to go with that direction if we're in the right direction. What will send you in the right direction without knowing anything else, this idea that I don't know where I'm going or where I should go, but actually I don't need to, as long as I know where definitely not to go. That then starts a process that will refine and refine and refine. And at least I'm not going in the wrong direction. So what I would say in that regard is, if your knees are straight or almost straight, the hips can't be hanging. Now, eventually they can be, because just as I did here mechanically, I bend those knees a great deal to get that flat, and then I can maybe unbend, I can have the knees be not quite so bent and keep that there. But it's probably going to be held there in that shape. It's not released. But over a long period of time, you can be virtually locked. We don't want the knees locked, but you can be virtually straight and still be hanging. But that's a long process. That's a lot of complete release here for that to occur. So if you know that, okay, however my hips feel, even if they might feel fairly straight up and down with gravity, my knees are almost straight, then that's not what I want. So I would say allow the knees to be a little bit more unlocked. And so all those things, you just keep working on releasing. It will feel literally like the hips are hanging, hip cage are hanging, and eventually the whole spine, literally like it's hanging. But as we know, that really is dependent upon the strength of these and the stamina of the base to have that sense, that quality of hangingness. Here's something related to this that I wanted to do anyway. It actually fits right into what we're doing right now. It can be a useful tool in our standing practice and our shape in general, in whatever we do. Another little drill, a little technique to help us with shape and the quality of hanging. And that is allowing the body to fall, to drop, let the body drop. And our body will catch ourselves at some point before we hit the floor. Probably, hopefully. So I'm going to literally play with this idea of letting my body drop. I want my alignment with my feet and my knees to be good. And I'm just going to drop. Come back up. Like, kind of probably way up for contrast purposes. And I'm just going to drop. And I'm going to free fall, drop. Now your body, I'm not going to even tell you drop a couple inches, drop 3 or 4 inches, drop 5 inches. Let your body catch you naturally. I want you to be just drop. Your body's going to catch itself before you fall to the floor. And notice as you drop and when you finish dropping, the angle of your lower back, the angle of your hips. If you truly allowed yourself to drop, your hips will be hanging vertically. So it's a drill. So you let yourself drop and knees will bend far more than what we normally would do in standing. Drop. Let the body catch itself. Notice the feeling and quality of the hangingness, the angle of the hips, and do that a few times. That's the hips hanging. And really the tailbone and the pubic bone should be parallel, hanging the same because they're in the same cage. You drop, let the body catch yourself. And then once you drop, you probably dropped, a little bit further than what we normally have ourselves in standing. So once you drop, you get that nice straightness in the lower back and the hanging of the hips. Keeping that as released as you can. Have the knees come back so that they're just unlocked and not bent so much, and see how much of that hanging you can retain even as you come up a bit. And then drop again and see how far you can come up without losing that verticalness, hangingness. Just hanging in the hip cage. How far can you come up? And notice when you start to tighten and hold and change that angle from being totally vertically hanging. So even for just, a fraction of a second, if you have a true drop, that informs the angle and the shape. That will get you that angle and shape. If you get a true drop, you're going to get exactly that hanging angle. And then it'll take some work to have that when we're more up. But then now your mind and your body is getting a tactile experience and understanding of what that angle is and what that feels like to be truly hanging. Any comments or questions with that? It really releases.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see what, doing it over and over, like it's like coming into a naturalness that would be harder to find by calculated adjusting of all that.
Right.
Yeah.
For example, right. If I were to do all the things that we say to do, flatten the lower back or point the tailbone, all those things, sit into the quad, that's another angle of approaching this, another way of describing it. If I were to do that, which is what we normally are always doing, is slowly trying to approach that. We'll get the right angles, maybe, or approximate the right angles, but it's really difficult for people to truly release and let go. When we drop, you've attained that shape and angle without any tensing or putting into that position. You hung into that position or fell in that position. So let that be kind of a helpful thing for us, a contrast. When we normally do it, where we're doing it up here and we're doing it mechanically or changing the angles physically, mechanically, it really kind of minimizes how much we're really letting go. We might be getting, again, engineering the angles, but how much are we really letting go? So this drill is very good for getting there by releasing, getting there by falling, truly hanging, not by engineering it or tilting the pelvis, muscularly organizing the shape and angles. And then you can only release a little bit. You can only release so much. Here, for at least a fraction of a second, it's release. And then probably tight again once you stop, but at least it's in the right shape. And you had a moment in time of understanding of getting there without putting yourself there. Then see if you can take that into a little bit of movement. So we'll do serving T, and it's going to be maybe a little more challenging because the feet are a little wider and out. Drop and move into some movement. And notice when you're tightening in and tightening up and losing it. So then you can drop again. Another aspect you may or may not have noticed yet is when I really drop, my abdomen becomes neutral. It releases. Of course, when we do this mechanically, physically, as I said, there's still probably a lot of tension in there, not releasing completely. Same here in front, especially if you're bringing it forward like a pelvic tilt, tension here. When I do that drop, I conspicuously feel a total release of anything there. There's nothing there. There's no tension, no holding. It's neutral. And I get that from that, just that drop, more than being here and then consciously trying to release it. You get some release, but when I drop here, completely, there's nothing there. So do it as often as you need to and see if you can bring that into how much of that can you maintain in your movement, or at the very least, this is just as good as getting it. Notice when you're losing it, how much you're losing it, how much you're tightening, how much things are seizing back into where they were. That's training. That's really good training. So let's do a little bit of serving T. In this case, we'll call it parting horse's mane because we have a stance. And hang the hips. And you can hang the hips at any point in the weight shift. So certainly back here, I'm going to hang the hips. That straightens this, releases my abdomen. Can I keep that? I might maybe halfway through the weight shift, do it again. When the weight is forward, I can do it again if I need. So that's very informing to the body and the mind, to your sense in the body here of how body can be and where we want it ultimately to be. So you just free fall those hips. Just drop. The hips are released for a fraction of a second anyway. And that's actually what you want to approximate as best you can in the rest of the movement. You can always hang, drop for a fraction of a second whenever you want, as often as you want. And you just know that that's where you want to stay as best you can. At the very least, do that free fall every time you come back. But again, you can do it anywhere in that weight shift. Maybe you notice that it releases the abdomen, like I was noticing for myself. Then take it a step further in actual stepping and moving through our Tai Chi moves. So if you want to do parting horse's mane or brush knee, what have you, do a room length or so and drop as often as you want to. Certainly every time your weight's on that back leg, drop. Vertically, just drop. And notice how much you can notice in the hips being released. And let that carry through. Okay, let's come back. We'll just wind down. And just do a few commencement moves with a continual hanging, falling of the hips. And maybe once in a while, kind of an abrupt, truly dropping, letting go to inform our shape and our movement.